Okay, welcome back. This is Issues in Biotechnology, the way we work with life. And we're in the section now on applications in biotechnology. And this is the 5th lecture on agricultural biotechnology. And I want to consider now energy in the future of humanity. And in particular, biofuels for the future and what role agriculture will play on renewable resources and independence from foreign oil and its consequences on the carbon cycle. So biofuels in general, let's consider as a background why this might be an innovation we might want to pay more attention to. And given the technology and the tools that are in the box for manipulating plants, how will this come to bear on making crops and plants and other components of plants that might be useful as renewable resources? First of all, do you believe in global warming? We won't take this poll here, but commonly in my class before, this graph shows that most people say yes. And that is my students enrolled in this course, Issues in Biotechnology, would say yes. And that's probably not consistent with a poll throughout the United States by any means. I think it's 27% of the United States population does not believe in global warming. But you can look at books on both sides of this equation. Stuart Brand from Mother Earth Catalog and the Mother Earth Discipline. Also Bjorn Lomborg on Cool It, the Skeptical Environmentalist Guide to Climate Change. Or the other side of the equation certainly was Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. So the debate is centered around whether or not the planet is warming. There is a preponderance of data out there now by scientists globally to indicate that global climate change is occurring on a large scale, and that there is a role for greenhouse gases, one of which has drawn a lot of attention is carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere and its relationship to global climate change. And maybe you could debate about whether or not global warming is happening, and perhaps that phrase global warming has caused a lot of misconceptions all on its own. Warming. What part of the world is warming? All of it consistently? Not likely. But one thing we can't argue about is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is directly measurable. And we can measure the amount of CO2 that has existed previously and compare it to now. These are quantitative data that can be demonstrated. The concentration of CO2 out the window right now is about 392 parts per million as of 2011, and that's more or less consistent. It's somewhere between 2085 and 2009. All right, 285 and 295 parts per million almost anywhere on the planet. And that the concentration rose by 2 parts per million during 2000 to 2009 alone. So what, some people say? So CO2 is increasing. Well, actually, it's increasing quite a lot if you look at this graph, and you can say, what are the consequences of that? Well, the present level right now is higher than at any time during the last 800,000 years, and likely higher than in the past 20 million years. And you can say again, so what? Well, plants use carbon dioxide as their major substrate for photosynthesis. And you could again say, so what? That means that there's a lot of happy plants, right? That's an oversimplification at best. This photo shows the monthly average of CO2 concentration in 2003, where high CO2 concentrations of over 385 parts per million are in red, low CO2 about 360 in blue. Then the question comes, if CO2 is in fact increasing, and that's demonstrated because you can actually measure the amount of CO2 in ice bubbles that are captured from ice cores through the Antarctic that go back a good amount of time. And this is quantitatively and easily measured. And you can do this over time through plants and fossilized plants as well, and get a clearer picture of what CO2 concentration has been in the past and compare that to now. So these are virtually inarguable numbers. The CO2 out the window is 385 parts per million or higher right now. That's that. That's a fact. Is it anthropogenic? That is it made by man? So, people will say, well, I don't know, global climate change, maybe we're just going through some sun seasonal, thing, that these cycles come and go. We've had ice ages and this and that, but really, let's remind ourselves, 385 parts per million out there now. What's the consequence of 385 parts per million is really the question you should ask. Is it anthropogenic? You can argue about that, but that's not going to change the number outside the window. It's 385 parts per million. You could say, is there anything we can do about that? Again, it's 385 parts per million. Burning fossil fuels is the leading cause of increased anthropogenic CO2. Deforestation is the second major cause. If you keep cutting down plants that sequester CO2 and you keep putting out CO2 from burning fossil fuels that has locked carbon underground for millions of years, of course that's going to contribute to CO2 in the atmosphere. Keep in mind that we're in a finite space. The amount of atmosphere relatively is the thickness of the orange coloring on a basketball. How much CO2 can you put up there before you are going to change the overall concentration? It's measurable, it's calculable. There are natural sources of CO2. You're one of them. Every time you breathe, you contribute to CO2. Methane is another greenhouse gas. And we can say that cow flatulence contributes to methane. That's true and measurable. There's also another contribution to methane, and that's going to be from the release of decomposing plant material as the Arctic tundra thaws. This will release an increasing amount of methane gas that is incomparable to the amount that's produced by agricultural sources for sure. Why is the tundra thawing? Do you think it might have something to do with increased CO2 concentrations? Is there anything that we can do about that? Is it anthropogenic? What are the consequences of rising CO2 in the atmosphere? Plants use CO2, and different plants use CO2 differently. In this slide, I just show you the characteristics between broadly categorized plants, those known as C3 plants and those known as C4 plants. So what? Well, we've selected our agricultural crops for their ability to grow in certain areas under certain conditions. Do you think that some plants might benefit by increased CO2? Yeah. Maybe not the ones you want. Do you believe global warming is caused by humans? We can see that the response previously in this class was yes, but that's not shared by common poll numbers that we see across the United States recently. We can notice a large uptick in the CO2 concentration that coincidentally coincides with the Industrial Revolution and the burning of fossil fuels. What a coincidence. CO2 is the leading cause of increased anthropogenic CO2. Okay, we've been burning oil now for 150 years. Oil, remember, is the product of fossilized plants. It's been underground for millions of years. And now all of a sudden we're harvesting it and burning it and releasing that sequestered CO2 up into the atmosphere. There are other ways of naturally increasing CO2 concentration. You have to think of forest fires, burning biomass by countries who use that as a heat source or a cooking source. Volcanoes will release a lot of CO2. But all of that has been going on for the last 20 million years. There hasn't been another animal that has been burning fossil fuels that I know of. Certainly not to the extent that we do. So oil, it's been underground. How much is there? Certainly, it's a finite planet. There's only so much planet. How much oil can there possibly be? Is it infinite? I don't think so. It's a finite planet. There must be a finite space in which there is a finite amount of oil. How much can we suck out of there and burn before we just use it all up? If it's finite, there must be an answer to this question. Is it 20 years? Is it 50 years? Is it 200 years? Actually, it's an interesting question when you pose this to executives from oil companies. You very likely won't get a straight answer. Not because they're hiding it in particular, but because this is a bit difficult question to answer. In fact, I would suggest that the correct answer to this question is actually listed under E. I'm not an optimist that there's an infinite amount of oil. I just said that there is not. We will never run out of oil. It'll just become prohibitively expensive to use it the way we do now. And subsequent generations down the road will perhaps look back at us and say, can you believe they just burned it? They just burned it. We will never run out. It'll just become like diamonds. You know, I can imagine that sooner or later it'll only be used as a lubricant, and then after that it'll only be used as a curiosity, and after that it'll become a gem. But it will never run out, I doubt. 10 billion people, all looking for the last drops of a finite resource and its benefits. I asked in the ethics questions on agricultural biotechnology, what is the carrying capacity of the planet? And we brought up the provocative essay by J.H. Fremlin and the consequences of a 37-year doubling time. And there have been essays written on the carrying capacity of the planet, and some of them are very interesting, and many of them seem to polarize 2 points of view. And I'm generalizing here, but it's an interesting analysis and an interesting way to present what the answer might be to the carrying capacity of the planet. And one point of view is stereotyped by the economist, who would say that as resources become limited, humans will innovate new solutions. That's extremely optimistic, if you ask me, but I'm a biologist. Now, for the economist, there's no limit to population under that situation. Pile them up as high as you can. We will innovate a solution. When we run out of oil, we will figure out something new. And you know, there's some legitimacy to this argument. When we ran out of whale oil, we figured out something new. And this is true for replacements of lots of previous technologies. Think papyrus, think paper, think books. And as we progress, we innovate. And now, let me suggest the biologist's point of view is a bit more pragmatic, if not pessimistic, that as population increases from a lag phase to an exponential growth phase, resources become limiting, toxic waste increases, life and death equilibrate until a falling into eventual collapse. So the curve of this growth pattern would look something like this, where if you were to put one cell into a Petri plate, a finite growth medium, that cell would divide into 2 cells, into 4, etc. And if you were measuring growth on this axis over time, it would seem as though that remains very steady as 2 goes to 4, and then suddenly it hooks up into exponential growth phase. And right there it starts to look very much like that graph I showed you from Thomas Malthus, in 1798. And this is where we find ourselves now in human growth. And now if you're evaluating back to our Petri plate, eventually resources become limiting, cell death starts to equilibrate with cell growth, toxic wastes increase, and so the growth eventually levels off, death exceeds growth until you get collapse. And that's a typical growth curve for what you would see in bacterial colonies on a Petri plate. It turns out that in many ecological situations, whether it's rabbits under a selective pressure by their predator, or fish under selective pressure by humans, this is a common growth curve, perhaps what you'd experience by humans. So, where are we on this growth curve? But let's remember, this is mitigated by human innovation. So the biologist providing the pragmatic, pessimistic point of view versus the economist saying we will innovate. Here we go. We're doing the largest experimental growth curve the human population has ever experienced, lifetime. George Bush famously, in his State of the Union address in January 2006, stated, "America is addicted to oil." Well stated. We run on it, we use it, we abuse it. American politics is strongly predicted by the price of gas at the gasoline pump. That's odd too. I bought some water this morning. My bottled water is more expensive than gasoline. So in a country that is so hyper paranoid about gas prices, it's still cheaper than water. But you don't see politics won or lost over the price of bottled water. Nonetheless, America is addicted to oil. This is a correct statement. And there is a finite amount. How much is left? We are burning what took millions of years to make, and it can't be replenished that easily. You're not going to refossilize plant material in order to replace existing reserves of oil. Can it be made synthetically? Maybe. What will happen, though, is it runs out. What can we innovate to be the next stone to jump to? Right now, the planet uses about 5 terawatts of energy. And that energy is used by 7 billion people. Sunlight brings into the equation about 101,000 terawatts of energy into the equation. So we only need to harvest 15 terawatts of energy to supply all the people with their current energy needs. So a lot of energy comes to the earth as sunlight. What's the best way that we could possibly use to harvest this energy as a resource? That energy is there. It's bombarding our planet. I'll get back to this later. It's an interesting question, though. How much is left of our current energy resources. This estimate was published in the journal Science in the August 13th issue 2010, so it's relatively recent. And it evaluates this question in terms of coal, natural gas, oil, and nuclear power, showing reserves of coal could last 251 years, pretty good. Resources, 360 years, also pretty good, but realize the economic or the environmental consequences. The pollution of coal, CO2 to the atmosphere, you got to dig it out, all of this. Natural gas now is cheaper than it ever was. But really, how much natural gas is there? Maybe about 64 years in reserves, 210 years in resources, and all of you won't be around in 210 years. Subsequent generations will have to deal with that, and you can say, so what? That's their problem. Oil, by the estimate published here, 41 years. 41 years. You will be here in 41 years, most likely. Some of you. Resources, maybe 125 years. But this is global. So who's going to get that oil? Nuclear, 82 years in reserves, but nuclear lasts a long time. So there might be 10,000 years in resources. But CO2 is the problem. Output. CO2 output from these resources is shown from this same article at the upper part of this slide, showing the CO2 relative to the plume that's emitted from the symbol of its contributing resource. So you can see that wind, biomass, hydroelectric, nuclear have relatively small plumes, whereas the contribution from other resources can be quite large. Also, we have to consider that water is a limiting resource for energy. Now, you don't think about that very often, but when you're using energy, you're also putting a strain on water resource. And depending on the source of your energy, depends on how much water is required for that energy resource. If you're going to grow crops, it's going to use water. Virtually any sort of energy that is going to be produced is going to impinge on our water resource. So our energy consumption, a river runs through it. A river of water runs through it. And right now you might think that oil's limiting. Water will be the next oil. It already is in many areas of the world. And for us here, water, water everywhere. Ah, it's so great. But we contaminate our water resources because we're bad stewards of that resource. The energy problem, then, is also a water problem. I'll get back to that, too. What will happen globally when we start to run out of oil? Well, we're already starting to see the consequences of this. So let's consider now biofuels, or what other sustainable options are there out there for the huge amount of energy that we consume. 15 terawatts is a lot of energy, but it's increasing. So what sort of, if oil is not sustainable because we're sucking it out and burning it, that's certainly not a sustainable situation. What sort of sustainable situation can we create for the future? Innovation. Innovation, bring it on. Now's the time. What's the role of biotechnology for energy in the future, whether that's through crops or other innovations that we can put on our futuristic goggles and try to see into the future with? Why biofuels? Anthropogenic climate change. Can we just keep sending up endless amounts of CO2 by burning fossil fuels? And its adverse effects, not only globally, but as in this issue of nature from 2005 points out, regional health impacts can be seen. I just flew out to Chicago recently, and I've been doing this over a period of years. And as any of you know, flying into Chicago, you noticed a couple of things. Urban sprawl, for one, is extensive. You know, the suburban areas around Chicago have increased dramatically during my lifetime flying over and into Chicago O'Hare Airport. The other thing you notice is the color of the atmosphere. From about like 10,000 feet down, there is this funky colored haze. And this is not fog. And if you've ever woke up in LA, you can actually, in the early morning hours, see mountains. And they're not there after rush hour. Or a place like Riverside, California, which used to be orange groves, had mountains as a backdrop. Interesting. So there's a regional aspect to this as well. It's not just global, but certainly that's a contribution. Donald Kennedy, the former editor for AAAS in Science, wrote in December 8th issue of 2007 that a solution to a sustainable source of energy may be the most significant challenge to future human survival. So sustainable solutions. Let's set the stage first. Why biofuels? I just brought up some of those. What are the alternative fuels as a renewable resource? And what are the possible energy sources that we have available to us now? And then, in the conclusion of this, I really want to put on, as I said, our futuristic goggles and take a look going forward. So, oil. That's, you know, what we think about most right now. We put it into our gas tanks. We heat our homes with it. We use it for jet fuel. We use it to ship things across the oceans. What will happen as it runs out? As I said, it's a finite amount. We're already starting to see the ramifications. There will be wars and struggles over the last few drops. Where have the recent struggles been? It's not over countries that make broccoli. There will be economic catastrophes as we struggle to balance the equations that rely on fossil fuels for this economy. Everything is hanging. If you look at the price of oil and its effect on the stock exchange rises and falls with the price of oil. So does economic forecasts for the future. Oil. But as we run out, owing to the creative, innovative nature of the human mind, we will see alternative developments. Crisis creates innovation. There are problem solvers amongst us. It's a great part of humanity. And already we can see that some of these innovations are resulting in solutions that will provide sustainable, clean energy. Are these the best? No. But Orville and Wilbur proved that they could fly. You know, so we have to start somewhere, and I think the situation is now creating the possibility for innovations that will provide the shoulders on which giants will stand. This issue of Science contained a review of many different solutions to sustainability and energy. One of these looked at renewable energy sources and the realities of setting the energy agenda. And the European Commission then, in this issue, and this was already 2007, was devoted to considerable attention to energy issues. And I think this now raising the concerns even back as far as 2007 that are just challenging what we now understand about our environment as well as our resources in this area. This graph details the total world primary energy supply as it was in 2004, where the renewables demonstrates a very small sector of that pie. Oil still, I think, is around 35% of that pie, coal 25% or so, gas around 20%. So total fossil fuels then contributing the majority of that pie, nuclear only about 6.3%, and some skepticism about that industry going forward after the tsunami in Japan. And as a result of that, Germany now going against nuclear power, and America now going online with one more nuclear power plant. But what about nuclear power? Certainly one of its downsides over the year is, well, that might be okay, but there are certain safety issues. I would say that nuclear submarines have had an outstanding safety record. However, nuclear waste also poses a persistent problem. What do you do with that? You know, waste is an interesting word all to itself because it in itself is an admission of the lack of innovation, isn't it? Waste? Waste? What is waste? But the admission that you just haven't thought of what to do with it yet. Really? Do you just bury it? Oh, you mean to tell me it's not useful for something? Really? Let's get smart. Get safe, get smart. So this other interesting part of this pie shows that traditional biomass is 8.48%. What do they mean by traditional biomass? Stuff you burn. That's a cooking in developing countries. That's traditional biomass. Modern biomass is only 1.9%. Stuff that we can make fuels out of, corn ethanol and things like that. Geothermal, 0.2%. It's great if you got it, but it's not available everywhere. Wind, again, great if you got it, but how much wind is there? And most of these, whether it's nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, wave, tides, are making electricity. There is still a need for liquid fuel. Are you going to run cars and planes, especially on electricity? We need some serious innovations in those areas in order to accomplish that technology. This shows some of the energy renewables in 2004 and the source of those technologies in terms of the share in that sector related to total energy, showing that actually modern biomass does pretty well. And in the bottom part, table 2, ethanol costs as a liquid fuel relating to energy balances, and demonstrating that sugarcane in Brazil has turned out to be a very good source of liquid fuel that is an alternative to oil. Can we harvest plant energy? Can we sustain agriculture to develop liquid fuels? What will it take? What's the time frame? Can we achieve energy independence? Brazil, it's been said, is independent of foreign oil, owing to the fact that it can make ethanol out of sugarcane. Corn. We grow a lot of corn. It's a $53 billion industry, most of that going into animal feed, another sizable component going into high fructose corn syrup, and an ever-increasing sector of that going into ethanol that is used for road fuel as 85% gasohol. So there was a industry line that said live green, go yellow, and for obvious reasons corn is already available for ethanol because we have the technology to do that. Any bootlegger has demonstrated that you can ferment the carbohydrates easily in the starch in corn, into ethanol. That's largely been used for recreational resources in the past, but on a large scale can be used to drive an automobile. So energy then from corn, and we can increase the amount of corn. But can we increase the amount of corn indefinitely? How much arable land can we increase for corn production? And if we're going to increase the amount of corn production, what do we have to take out of food production in order to do that? These are questions. What are the inputs versus the outputs? From this article published by the National Geographic a few years ago, it shows the NEB, the net energy balance ratio of corn ethanol, to be 1.3. So energy out is slightly higher than energy in. So the inputs into corn, you've got to pull a tractor over it several times, you've got petrochemicals involved, you've got to ferment it, and your bang for the buck out of ethanol is roughly only about a half of what gasoline is. So the net energy balance ratio is really only about 1.3. So live green, go yellow? Oh, that's debatable. The drawbacks are that we use corn for food. Arable land is limiting. Corn is expensive. Is corn-based ethanol a sustainable solution that would displace oil? I'm going to tell you now that there is not one solution here. There are many. And I don't know if we can actually afford to take any of them off the table. Other questions regarding corn-based ethanol. Is it good for the environment? How will it affect food production? If we're putting food into our gas tank, will the cost of our other foods and commodities rise? Can we meet energy needs with corn? Will genetic modification for biofuels affect food? Would we likely now divert traits to ethanol production in corn to increase ethanol or other biofuels components at the expense of what we would do for traits in a food crop? And how about sugarcane? It's done wonders in Brazil. That the net energy balance ratio for sugarcane is 8, as demonstrated in this National Geographic article. And Brazil is largely independent of foreign oil owing to this, and it took them a fair amount of time to get to that point. It just didn't happen overnight. Ethanol for a sustainable energy future. Now, sugarcane ethanol is good. You're pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, sequestered by photosynthesis, that is then recycled. So it's carbon neutral, if not carbon negative, to the situation. However, we have to consider this too. If Brazil gets really good at making ethanol from sugarcane, how much rainforest will be eliminated for ethanol exports? If they want to make more money out of their ethanol, might it be at the expense of a limiting resource? And who would we be able to, who are we to say, hey, don't cut down your forest. Don't cut down your forest for ethanol. You know? Like we did that, you know? We were so conservative with our natural resources, but I'm kidding. And like I said, it took Brazil a fair amount of time to get to the place where they are more than breaking even. As shown here, this occurred really only in about 2005 or so. So is it sustainable? What are the environmental consequences? Other renewables might be from oils that are produced by plants, and there are a number of oil-producing crops that might be considered for this purpose, including soybean. Vegetable oils made from plants can be used for fuel. There is biodiesel, but oil itself from plants can be produced. You can think of palm oil is a good natural resource for oil. Eutropha is a tree that produces nuts that are very rich in oil as a resource, grown in some areas of the world. The croton plant, Megalocarpus, is also a possible tree that can produce a large amount of oil. Soybeans and canola, also sunflowers are crops that we could harvest for oil. Peanuts, and these could be genetically modified to increase not only the amounts of oil for fuel, but the constituents of oil. Genetic modifications have been achieved in these crops to modify oil for health purposes, but we could also do this specifically for the types of oil that we would use for fuel. And there are things like the biodiesel bus, the soybean bus. The bus runs on biodiesel. And there are people who have made cottage industries out of recycling vegetable oil from fast food restaurants. Well, that's good. All of this contributes to sustainability. There's no question about it. But do the math on that one. You've got to cook a lot of French fries in order to come up with the amount of oil that we do. I mean, it's great. Go run your van on recycled vegetable oil. That's good, but if we wanted to run New York City's traffic on vegetable oil, I really doubt that there is a resource available to meet that need. So what's the NEB for biodiesel soybean? It's really low. It's only about 2.5. Again, a lot of inputs, still better than maize, not as good as sugarcane. That leads me to algae. Algae is an underexploited resource right now, I think with a lot of promise, and there are a lot of companies now that are focusing on the ability of algae to make oils, to make fermentable sugars. This doesn't use arable land. I think there is technology now coming online which will improve algal strains. There are many companies that are now getting into this as a viable opportunity, and I think we can think that there is good reason to think that there will be innovations in algal production and methods to harvest energy from algae. A company up here in Massachusetts, Dual, is devoted to these processes, as well as many other companies that have genetically modified algae to actually export sugars rather than retain them and harvest them, actually pump sugars out, continuous cultures that you can now ferment that sugar into ethanol or make other fuels out of them. So I think this is an unexploited and developing platform that we can conceive that we can see a lot of innovation and a lot of resource development in the future. What are the downsides? Well, if you genetically engineer algae and you think you're going to be growing it out in some pond out here in Narragansett or locally, you can think that one duck landing in that genetically modified pond might let's just go worst case scenario. What if you genetically modify an algae so it's going to grow like gangbusters, right? It's going to grow like crazy. And then that thing gets into some water resource that you might not want that algae, right? It could be worst case scenario invasive species that could cause a lot of problems. Now there are ways to counteract that, but again, this is something to think about. Synthetic biology now will come to bear on algae in a heavy way. We can now sequence the entire genome of some of these cyanobacteria and some of these eukaryotic algae very quickly. And we can do genetic modifications that will improve oil production, photosynthetic capabilities, and so on. I'll get back to that in a minute too. But what I mean to suggest here is this does not use arable land. It's not a food resource. It contributes to an area of technology that is now quite underexploited. And I think you will see in the future a large amount of resources devoted to this, and I can expect good things coming out of algae. So I think the other resources will contribute, yes. And we will see which racehorse actually crosses the finish line. But I can think of all of these contributing to renewable resources, and let's face it, they are renewable. We can grow them. While some of the population keeps harping on drill baby drill, I would like a refrain that says something like, grow baby grow. We can make it. We're not depending on them to give it to us or for us to take it from them. We can grow it. And what are the inputs for algae as a renewable resource? Light, water, CO2. We can use and sequester some of that CO2, or at least recycle it. We can use the tools of genetic modification and synthetic biology to make algae specifically for the purpose of renewables. We can make biodiesel, but there is also technology now to convert those hydrocarbons into gasoline. Yes, gasoline. Why not gasoline? Engines run on gasoline. We can make engines that run on ethanol, but it's a pain in the butt, and we've already made all of this technology to run on gasoline. We can make plastics. Right now, 13% of US oil goes into plastics. That's amazing. And we use it once and throw it away. And it will outlast any of us in this room. And it will never go away. There's a company called Metabolics that's just up here in Massachusetts that's making plastics out of a compound called PHA. Go, baby, go. Because PHA is an organic compound. So plastics out of an organic compound made by plants would save us 13% of our oil, and it would decompose into organic materials. It's a good solution. Is it there yet? It's close. They've been working on it for a long time. We should encourage these types of technologies financially. And then there are cellulosic materials. Plants. Most of the carbohydrates in plants are locked up as cellulose. Cellulose is recalcitrant to being broken into its constituent sugars, or else every organism on the planet would be eating the stuff. So cellulose has captured a lot of carbon on this planet that normally is released only when we burn it. So what is cellulose? How is it made? This publication came out of the Department of Energy in 2006 as a roadmap for using biomass, that is the cellulosic component of plants, for biofuels. So switchgrass is the platform technology used by that company, Metabolics, to genetically modify it to produce plastics. But cellulosics can also be used to create liquid fuel. It can be broken down into its constituent sugars and made into ethanol. If current technology is used, the NEB for cellulosic ethanol is only 2. Still higher than maize, but still not that great. But most of the plants that we are considering using for this process are perennials, meaning that you would plant it once and harvest it year after year. And as the technology gets better for releasing the sugars that we can ferment or produce into other hydrocarbons like biodiesel and gasoline, we would expect an NEB, as shown here by National Geographic, of about 36. So the inputs are low, outputs are high, we're getting closer to where we want to be. Other sources of cellulosic biomass besides switchgrass might be poplar or the so-called corn stover, the stalks that are left in the farm field after the corn has been harvested. All of these produce resources of cellulosic material that can be produced into energy. But biomass is recalcitrant. in engineering plants or enzymes for biofuels production has been a focus of research so far. How can we make the sugars that are present locked up in the energy in biomass available for production of liquid fuels and other fuel resources? Cellulose as a composition for biomass in most plants is about 44% of biomass. Hemicellulose is a polymer of xylose, and that's about 30%. So combined, 74% is available as a polymer of sugars that could be harvested for liquid fuels. Lignins are a polymer of phenolics and comprise roughly about 26% of plant cell walls. So just to clarify for a minute, cellulose is a polymer of glucose where the bonds as shown here alternate as a disaccharide that makes cellobiose. And it's these bonds that prove difficult to break to release its constituent sugars. But the chemistry for doing this is well known, and there are enzymes that are capable of breaking down cellulose and converting that polymer into simple sugars that can then be used to ferment into ethanol, butanol, or converted into other hydrocarbons. Where are these enzymes? Well, they're found in nature. Think about the termite. The termite eats wood. Is it the termite gut that's actually dissolving this stuff into sugars? No. There's some microbe that's living in the termite gut that has cellulases, that is digesting the cellulose into its constituent sugars that is then conveniently used by the termite. So these enzymes are proteins. The genes for those proteins have been cloned. Those have been moved into other organisms, including plants. But if you say if we move a cellulase into plants, it will dissolve itself. Why don't we put it behind a switch that is activated post-harvest? This has been done by some people. So there is innovation afoot. There is energy resource. It's renewable. It can be unlocked. And the human mind now is addressing the problems and the challenges necessary to do that. So cellulases in bacteria and fungi are capable of digesting this, whether we put that into the plant or we grow it in vats that then can be harvested and applied to fermentators in a process that are used by some companies today. So the roadmap in that 2006 publication, as shown here, shows the growing of biomass, whether that is corn stover, poplar, plants like perennial grasses, and then reducing that biomass by a pretreatment into cellulose, cleaning out its lignin resource, breaking down by hydrolysis the cellulose into its constituent sugars, and then on the right-hand side, using biorefineries to make ethanol or some other liquid resource. It has been stated that we have what we need now to produce ethanol from cellulose, and we can grow it. The key is to integrate the pieces into an economically competitive process and commercialize it. If we can make ethanol or any other hydrocarbon for $2 a gallon, who's going to buy gasoline? And if you made gasoline $8 a gallon, I assure you that these processes would go a lot faster. Switchgrass was also mentioned by George W. Bush in his 2006 address. Now this struck me as very odd when I was listening to that State of the Union address. In fact, I nearly fell off my chair because I had been working on the genetics of switchgrass for exactly this reason. And so you can imagine how astounded I was to hear it come from a State of the Union address by George W. Bush. I even wondered who told him to say that. So, sustainable solutions, what are they? In this editorial by Stephen Kooning, who was then the chief scientist for BP, looking at getting serious about biofuels. This is not a luxury item anymore. We're running out of oil. Sometimes we're lulled into complacency, thinking like, oh, we'll get to that later. But really, looking at some of these solutions and acting on it now before we're scrambling towards the end. And I think this is an interesting statement that he makes in this article, that genetic improvement of energy crops like switchgrass, poplar, eutropha has barely begun. In other words, we've not really applied the tools of modern biotechnology to these crops seriously for their production as biofuels. Most of them have existed as feedstocks for agricultural purposes, or as merely wild plants. And the Department of Energy has put forward a very aggressive campaign about replacing foreign oil. And you can see that it's a 15-year time span involving 5 years of research, technology deployment, and systems integration accordingly. And we're already behind this projection. But this has also spurred a number of startup companies that you can see are being, that are responding to the challenge of bioenergy. And so a certain entrepreneurialism is being spurred on by this innovation. And I think we can see that out of this will grow even more innovation spurred on by the possibility of economic success. But this is a drop in the bucket. If we are going to get serious about this, we need to really apply serious funding. Companies like Iogen already have biorefineries in place. Can we grow enough cellulosic biomass to supply these companies? So there's a chicken and the egg. Is the farmer going to go out and invest and buy into producing biomass unless there is a production and a consumer market in order to deliver it? No. The whole thing kind of stalls right there as long as we have cheap gasoline. So I love Iogen's website. I think it's very upbeat about cellulosic ethanol being ready to go. And it shows that these companies have the technology to do this, and it will be improved if it's market driven. Switchgrass. Why switchgrass? Where was he coming from? And who told him to say that? But really, out of all of the plants, really, why switchgrass? Well, it turns out that he was fairly well informed on this one. That switchgrass was the US DOE and USDA plant of choice for biomass production, and as a possible candidate for cellulosic conversion into liquid fuels. So the role of genetics and varietal selection plays not only into the role of plants like switchgrass, but also plants like poplar, miscanthus, and other grasses, and other perennial plants that may be a resource for liquid fuel production. But why switchgrass? What is switchgrass? Well, it's Panicum virgatum. There, that tells you. Panicum virgatum, switchgrass, is a grass that's perennial, grows in North America, indigenous to North America, grows from Maine down to Florida, west out to Denver, north to North Dakota, and even places now in the Northwest. In our lab, and once in a while we'll bring in our own research as it's relevant to this course, and so you can get an idea what I'm up to also. We initiated a project several years ago to improve the genetics of switchgrass relative to biofuels production specifically. We wanted to improve varieties of switchgrass as they would be useful for agricultural production, that is increasing yield per acre, and improving other agronomic characteristics that might be useful for production of switchgrass, as it might be a resource for cellulosic biomass. So we called this project, we dubbed it Project Golden Switchgrass. We want to make the switchgrass that everyone would use if they wanted to apply this as an agricultural resource for biofuels. So we started on improving public varieties of switchgrass, and funded by the Department of Energy, we have now done the genome sequencing of all 17 public available varieties. We have the DNA sequence through Yale Genome Sequencing Center for all 17 public varieties of switchgrass. This provides us with a significant knowledge base to apply advanced genetics for breeding, but also to look at other genetic approaches to improving switchgrass. We collaborate with a grower, a seed company in Pennsylvania that's the largest producer of switchgrass in North America, the Ernst Conservation Seed Company, who is producing publicly available varieties as a seed resource for this research. And I want to make the point that this is not only for production of ethanol, but other hydrocarbons. We are interested in the production of gasoline. As I mentioned, I think ethanol has its downsides. It is a renewable resource, true, and in production from plants like switchgrass is carbon negative, owing to the fact that carbon is going into root production and you're only harvesting the above ground portion. But we're interested in developing technologies that would make better switchgrass and hopefully see that as an end product in gasoline and other liquid fuels. I thought this was a clever image. Gasoline at the gas pump. Notice the price in the back. This was a few years ago, but that's about what it is today. And there are other cellulosic biomass crops shown in this map and regionally where they could be produced. Actually, I think this map should be somewhat amended, is that switchgrass grows regionally over a larger portion of the United States than shown here, but it also depicts other contributions from things like hybrid poplar, eucalyptus, black locust, silver maple, willows, and shrub willow is a good crop for doing this. Sorghum, sweet sorghum, miscanthus. So where will biomass be produced? Well, regionally, according to that map I just showed you. What will be the environmental consequences? Well, actually growing these crops provide a very nice natural resource for birds, migratory birds. These are perennial crops, so soil erosion will be low. Inputs will be low. They require little fertilizer. They're drought tolerant, pest resistant already. And as I said, there are other crops that will contribute to this. This is not only just one crop, switchgrass, but a contribution towards sustainable biomass. And this is areas depicted in this map which show the amount of tonnage which could be harvested from biomass in the United States. And these are switchgrass bales from a 5-year-old field in northeast South Dakota in 2005. And it's this kind of harvest that will be utilized out of these types of perennial grasses. With the Ernst Conservation Seed Company, we are also focusing on regionally selected germplasm. That we know that there are varieties, wild varieties that have been grown in Florida that grow well in Florida, that are adapted to Florida, and that we can improve Florida-specific varieties for Florida. Similarly, North Dakota, Connecticut, etc. and that these are carbon negative. This excellent article by the prairie ecologist David Tillman shows the low input, high density mixtures of native grassland perennials that can be used for biofuels, demonstrating in this comparison that these prairie grasses have the capability of reducing greenhouse gas emissions greatly in comparison to corn grain, ethanol, and soybean, and actually have very low inputs of phosphorus and nitrogen relative to corn, shown on the far left and adjacent to that soybean used for biodiesel, and also lower pesticide use. Technology improvements have come recently in the area of processing and harvesting that I think make this technology even more available to the consumer, and companies like Poet have contributed a great deal towards this actualization. So back to golden switchgrass. Can we actually pull this off? It's possible, as we mentioned, to clone any gene and move that into plants. How will this be used in terms of modifying switchgrass? Well, certainly all of your favorite traits that have been now used in other row crops can be applied to cellulosic biomass. Herbicide resistance, pest tolerance, drought tolerance, etc., even making bioplastics, such as the accomplishment by the company Metabolics. So we are in a collaboration with the University of Rhode Island, together with Yale University, that are contributing to a now new startup company called Plant Advancements that I'm a co-founder of. And this will contribute new germplasm that will be grown by companies like Ernst Conservation Seed that will then produce that biomass for companies like Iogen and Poet in order to make into liquid fuels. So what this is meant to do is to create the germplasm in the entire pipeline into liquid fuel production. We have the ability in our lab to genetically modify grasses. Basically, given any DNA sequence, we can put this into a large range of grasses, and we've been working on switchgrass now for the last 6 or 7 years. So using embryogenic cell cultures, we can deliver DNA by agrobacterium, recover transformed colonies that we can then regenerate into whole plants containing the gene sequences that we put in. We even do this with student resources and with student projects here at the University of Rhode Island. So Project Golden Switchgrass, what do we want to do? Well, there are several traits shown here that we could accomplish. Increased photosynthetic capabilities, optimized photoperiod response, optimized crown leaf architecture for biomass increasing, regulate dormancy, delayed leaf senescence. All of these can be modified by genetics. But there's an interesting trait shown here on the upper right-hand side of this slide, floral sterility. Floral sterility is a major trait in switchgrass. Why? Well, switchgrass is indigenous to North America. There may be traits that we want to put into switchgrass for biofuels that we might not want to communicate to the wild population. Plastics, for example. Do we want plastic production growing in indigenous plants? Or if we make switchgrass drought tolerant, would it then become an invasive species forcing pressure on other plant species? So to limit communication between those genetic modified genes into wild populations for gene confinement is a strategy that we consider in the laboratory. We also have the capability of doing wide intergeneric crosses in our lab, where we've taken genetically modified switchgrass that's herbicide resistant and mated it with another species. So I mentioned that switchgrass is a species Panicum amarum. I have a graduate student who graduated from the University of Rhode Island, and we forced a cross between Panicum virgatum and Atlantic coastal panic grass, a separate species. And we made a hybrid between Panicum amarum and Panicum virgatum and produced a fertile outcome that was also herbicide resistant, communicating the gene to this now hybrid. Realize what we did. We took two species that normally don't mate, and we made a separate new species, a separate new hybrid of those plants that was herbicide resistant. Now it's GMO. We then took the outcome of those and back-crossed it to switchgrass. So now the GMO is segregating in two directions. Half the population is non-GMO, and half the population is GMO. Now what we've done is created a new breeding technology where we can create hybrids in two generations that are non-genetically modified, using the genetically modified intermediate. We just submitted a series of patents on that, as I think it's widely applicable to other plants. Very cool. That's shown in this slide as how we did that. And both of those were tetraploids, and now we're applying that technology to other varieties of switchgrass and other wide crosses for a similar technique. We can also achieve total floral sterility by making male steriles and female sterile lines that we can combine to make a total sterile outcome. So Plant Advancements is the company that I co-founded with Calvin Ernst, who is the founder of Ernst Conservation Seed Company, in order to actualize the outcomes of this research commercially, and hopefully this aids into making plants that are better for making biofuels. So the grass is greener. The grass is greener for the future, and I believe that the future of biofuels will help contribute to renewable liquid fuels in the future. The ability to do this is with us. These are the new species that we created in the lab. We now have the ability to follow the genetics of this. We have sequenced mom and we've sequenced dad. We have the entire genome sequence of both of them. We can line them up and see what the differences are. Base pair by base pair, we can compare them. We can see what made mom and dad different from each other. They were separated geographically. We brought them together in this unique cross and have combined characteristics that we hope will be agronomically significant for biofuels. What you see here is a new hybrid that has never before been created by the intervention of a human. And now what we're able to follow is, as we back-cross those to dad, we can compare how these genes now separate. We are now going to be able to witness, for maybe one of the first times at a genetic level, the creation of a new species. This has been done by humans before, but we've got an exquisite opportunity to do this at a DNA level that perhaps is unprecedented. That's pretty exciting, I think. But before I say thank you on biofuels, I want to ask you right now to put on those futuristic goggles. Where is this really going? Is this the future? It is for now. This is good. This is good. We can grow this. We don't have to kill anybody in order to get this resource. We just need to grow it. But what is the future? Let me be very optimistic for a moment. Plants photosynthesize. That's obvious. Using sunlight, they convert that energy into the chemical energy that's used to harvest carbon from carbon dioxide and attach it to a 5-carbon sugar to make glucose. That reaction has been going on for 3 billion years. There it is, proof of principle. plants harvest light and make energy. All of the energy on this planet, biologically, comes to us through photosynthesis. All of it. The rest of it is just passing it around from one organism to another. But there's a part of that reaction that I left out. Light comes in to a photoreceptor. That photoreceptor has an excited electron that's passed around, and water is split. Water is split into hydrogen ions and oxygen. All of the oxygen on this planet came to us from this reaction. There would be no oxygen on this planet unless plants had split water. That's still where we get all of the oxygen that we breathe. It's from photosynthesis. Is it possible that we could make artificial photosynthesis, taking a bio-inspired method that plants have been using for billions of years, and use that to split water, using the 101,000 terawatts of sunlight energy that comes to us to split water into hydrogen, and use hydrogen as our ultimate energy resource? Artificial photosynthesis is the challenge now for humans. That's my position. Here is a configuration of photosynthesis showing its constituents as photosystem 2 on the left, where it receives light energy that is passed through several different photosynthetic protein components in the thylakoid membranes of chloroplasts, where at a manganese center, that electron transfer results in the splitting of water, shown here on the lower left. Photosystem 1 is another component which receives sunlight for the carbon fixation reactions. Plants use the hydrogen ions to drive ATP synthesis, that's the chemical energy, in order to harvest carbon. By using the light-splitting reactions of photosynthesis, if humans could mimic photosynthesis, either as a biomimetic ultimately, or harvest its process in order to split water, we would have the ultimate energy resource, hydrogen, with no carbon intermediate. Using sunlight, plants split water, making hydrogen. It's very simple. If humans learn to do this, there is unlimited energy. It's that simple. But wait, that's a little like pointing to the moon and saying, there it is, why don't we just go there? It took a lot of people and a lot of money and a lot of courage in order to take that one small step. And that's the situation right now. There it is. There's the answer. It's always been there. But getting from here to there is just not one smart person. I think we all ought to drop whatever you're doing right now and do this. That's how important it is. I actually think it's a moral imperative. There's the solution. What are we doing right now that's more important than artificial photosynthesis? What are you doing? Making an iPad? Where's that going to get you? Really? It's a good trick, but really. Realize that when you split water, you make hydrogen. If you can make that into hydrogen gas, now you've really got something going. Because when you burn hydrogen gas, what's the outcome of burning hydrogen gas? It's a big bang. You know, the Hindenburg proved that. It's a big bang, and that's the outcome. You get a lot of energy. But what's the output? Water. So the input is water. Sunlight and water, you split into hydrogen, you harvest the energy, and you make water. in a world in which water is now becoming also a diminishing resource, you solve at least 2 problems at the same time, and maybe 5. You're out of the carbon equation. Greenhouse gases, I don't care about you anymore. Oil, all the lives that you'll save as we struggle for the last remaining drops can be useful for something else, hopefully. Split water. We have put together a consortium for bioenergy research comprising the University of Rhode Island, people at Draper Laboratories, a good friend and colleague of mine, Barry Bruce from the University of Tennessee, who did some studies a few years ago that were published in Nature Nanotechnology, which demonstrated, I joke with him a little bit, that he demonstrated the Orville and Wilbur, that you could fly. He took photosystem 1 components and coupled them to nanocrystals of platinum and demonstrated that you could make hydrogen gas. Other laboratories around the world are also pursuing this endeavor. People at Yale, people at Stanford, Jim Barber in the UK, some people at Penn State. You can list them though. You can list them. And the major researcher there gets $26 million, which is a large grant, but that's a drop in the bucket. Let's face it, this is the biggest problem facing humanity. We all ought to drop whatever we're doing. Spend $26 million in 1 day in Afghanistan. Solve the problem. And it's not going to take, it wasn't one person that got a Nobel Prize for landing on the moon. In fact, nobody got a Nobel Prize for landing on the moon. It was a whole team of people. A whole team of really smart people. So Barry demonstrated, oh, and I get to see him this weekend. I'm picking him up at the airport on Friday night. I get to tell him hopefully some good news about this. But Barry demonstrated self-assembled photosynthetic nanoparticles for cell-free hydrogen production already 2 years ago. And what he demonstrated is shown here in this slide, where the top part of this is how normal photosynthesis generates carbon fixation. And in the bottom part of this, the bio-inspired applied photosynthesis using photosystem 1 particles coupled to platinum nanocrystals to generate hydrogen gas. We will find better ways to do this. It might not be us, but somebody is going to do this. I want to be a part of that, don't you? This is the coolest thing there is, really. So utilizing photosynthetic components to derive energy. That is the future, clearly. We can do this. So our project that we just applied to a National Science Foundation grant for is titled SPHERE, Sustainable Photosynthetic Hydrogen Evolution Research. And we're not alone, we're a small group, and I hope we grow. And in order to do this kind of research, you need to be fluent in at least 5 languages. And I'm not talking about human languages, but scientific languages. You better be fluent in synthetic biology. You also better be fluent in the language of nanotechnology, quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, photosynthesis, obviously. Chemistry is going to be pretty important. Mathematics, nanoengineering. So we need a group of smart people, well-versed in science, technology, engineering, and math. That's the next generation. This will happen. This will happen. Mark my words, this will happen. I hope I'm a part of it. I hope you're a part of it. But this is clearly a solution that is viable. And if we put the elbow grease against this, we have a sustainable future. Energy will go out of the economic equation. Think about it. The mainframe computer is what we had. This big, bulky thing that you had to tie into. Yes. They got smaller according to Moore's law. And the big mainframe computer, now we never would have thought of a personal computer, a PC that you could carry around 8 gigabytes in your pocket. Unbelievable, the personal computer. So now we have the grid. We have the grid that we all depend on until it goes down. Supplying the grid, we're all dependent on the grid. The grid is like the mainframe computer. The personalized power station is like the personalized computer. Every house will have their energy production system based on artificial photosynthesis, stored in the form of formic acid that's liberated by formic acid dehydrogenase, not batteries, to generate a continuous supply of hydrogen that can be used for any amount of electricity you want. Make turbines, keep your grid if you want. But every house in Africa will have their own energy source, not contributing to carbon. That's the promise of this. Get off your butts and let's do it. The future. Plants have proven, I think, the proof of principle. And some scientists already around the planet have beta tested that principle. Innovation. I think that's what we need to do now. Okay. Thanks.